Well, welcome, Compass North Fort Worth family, to our living room. I'm so glad that I'm able to share with you again today. It's been 4 weeks since I last spoke, and a lot has changed in our world, hasn't it? I mean, here we are. We're pretty much an online campus for at least the next several weeks. But I got to be honest with you, I'm grateful for technology that allows us still to gather together today. Now, many of you've maybe moved home into a home office like me, which is our dining room. Everything's kind of changed. Even the grocery store is going to the grocery store is different. And for some of you, you're not really loving that your kids are now homeschooled. A lot has changed, but there's one thing that hasn't changed, and that is God is His Word. And I'm excited to dig into His Word with you today. Next week is Easter Sunday, and I want to encourage you to invite someone you know to join you here online next week because it might be just what they need during this time. Now, before I get into the message today, I want you to know that we're going to take communion together at the end of the message, and so you might want to get that ready this morning before we get into the message. Well, a few years ago, maybe you remember this picture of this dress that caused the heated debate. Some of you, when you look at it, it's a gold and white dress, while others of you, when you look at it, it looks black and blue to you. And for all of you who see black and blue, I just have to tell you this morning that you're wrong. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news today. Because here's why. If you were to hold that dress in your hands and you could see in this picture, the original dress is gold and white. The second picture is what many of us see, and then there's the picture that some of you see, which is black and blue. And there are some moments in life that are like this black and blue dress that they don't appear as they seem. Just think about this as an adult, or if you're a parent watching this today. As an adult, you see the world differently than you did when you were in high school. Like when you were in high school, maybe you were like, I can't wait to get out of school and be an adult. But now that you're an adult, you're thinking, I wish I could be a kid again. Or how about as parents? How many times have you wished that you could get your children to see the things the way that you do? As I was sitting down to write this message, we were just 6 days into this whole social distancing and quarantining mandate from our government. And my kids were bored out of their minds. Maybe you can relate. Our son Blake had just asked me if he could go to a friend's house to spend the night. And I said, I'm sorry, buddy, but not this time. And his response was, well, you guys, you're just taking this too far. At the time, I wasn't sure if we were, but based on everything that I've read and I've heard and I've seen right now, I think we made the right decision. I was just trying to protect him. You see, he couldn't see it that way. He just thought we were trying to ruin his life. But isn't that how teenagers, they tend to think about their parents all the time? Today as we wrap up this series that we've been in called The Bad Boys of Easter, I want to talk about a relationship that is not necessarily as it appears through the story of one of these other bad boys that we find in the Easter story. And the relationship that I want to talk about today is this relationship between life and the relationship with God. And I think for many people, these two things can appear to be, or maybe even in your own experience, they can feel like the very same thing. And here's what I mean by that. Here's the first thing that I think we have to understand. We think that if life is good, then God is good. But when life isn't good, we tend to view God as not being good. Have you ever felt like this before? Like life is good, so God's good? But when things aren't going well in life, our thinking can easily shift to this question: where's God at in all this? Maybe even over the past few weeks, you've had your own doubts. Like you've been wondering, where is God at in all of this? But where is God at in the midst of COVID-19? And I think this leads to the second thing that can happen, and that is that disappointment with life easily becomes disappointment with God. When your dreams don't come true, when it's not working out, when you can't get the break that you hope for, when you're struggling financially, when maybe your marriage is falling apart, when it seems to be working for all the people around you but not for you, you can get disappointed with God. And after a while, what can happen is you begin to assume that maybe God's not good, or God's not personal, or even possibly maybe you can begin to think that there is no God at all. For you, maybe it isn't even whether God is real to you, but maybe he feels distant or he feels unconcerned about your life. And that feeling may be something that has grown over time. For someone here today, the bitterness might be the results from a series of bad breaks in your life. Maybe it's just this one big event in your life that left a bad taste in your mouth. Maybe for someone watching this, you lost a child, or your marriage was torn apart, or maybe you just recently lost your job. Maybe for someone you were mistreated or abused by a person that was supposed to protect you. Maybe for someone it's the loss of a parent or someone close to you that feels way, way too early. Maybe for someone it's a physical challenge that you've experienced or maybe you're still experiencing, and that has caused you to wonder, like, where's God at in all this? Or maybe you gave God this one chance and he didn't come through. And so you've never given him serious consideration again. Or maybe you were taught to believe that there's this personal God who is behind everything, like he's pulling the strings like a puppet master. And because that's what you were taught, it's hard not to turn your frustration on him. Because let's face it, if that's what God's like, then who needs God? Unfortunately, this line of thinking is how parents tend to control their kids, and pastors can manipulate their congregations, and kings control kingdoms. And in the story of the guy that we want to look at today, that is where he's at. Now, to be honest with you, we really aren't given a whole lot of details about this character. We don't even know his name, so I guess we'll just call him John Doe today. And this is what his social media profile picture would have looked like. Now, what we do know about this guy, just based on where we find him in Jesus' story, is somewhere along the way, he went down the wrong path. He went his own way, and he broke the law. And then he broke another law, which ended up getting him on Rome's most wanted list until he eventually gets caught. He's arrested, and he gets put on trial. The charges are laid out against him in a Roman court of law, and ultimately, what we find out about this guy is he gets convicted of these crimes. Now, the severity of the crime had to be pretty serious because his sentence wasn't to be sold as a slave. What he had done wasn't some misdemeanor that would have even had him end up manning an oar for a Roman ship. Based upon the crimes that this guy had done, there was only one good use for this man. The verdict by the court nailed him to a cross as an example to others as they walk the road, that if you defy the Roman government, this too would be your sentence. At this point, there was no one to plead his case. There'd be no mourners there for him. He knew that he had been abandoned by his friends and his family and the government. And at this moment in time, he even felt like his God had abandoned him. And on this day, as he was dragged out of that jail cell, there was no hope for him in this life. And it felt like there was no hope in the one to come either. On this day, this man decided that he would die the way that he had lived his life, that he would die defiantly. Now, maybe it was because he knew who was going to hang next to him. Maybe he had gotten a little early warning that it was going to be Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah, who would hang next to him. And he kind of saw the silver lining in the fact that there could be a large crowd that day gathered there to experience this. But our character wouldn't get the spotlight this day. In fact, we find the account of this in Luke's gospel recording of Jesus' life. And Luke, who was a well-respected doctor who had researched all this and talked to eyewitnesses from that day, he records this story that helps us to understand all that took place the day that Jesus got crucified. If you've got a Bible or a Bible app on your smartphone or tablet or whatever you're watching with, look at what it says in Luke chapter 22, starting in verses 32 and 33. It says, 2 other criminals were led out to be executed with him. But when they came to the place called the Skull, they nailed him to a cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. And so what we read here is that our John Doe, along with another criminal, are placed on crosses to the left and the right of Jesus. And as these guys hung on the cross, these two guys are hurling profanities at the Romans. They're cursing at the people that are passing by. But in the midst of all this chaos that ensued and all that's going on, it's the words of this Jewish rabbi who is now hanging between them that ring out. The words that Jesus spoke are words that no one, and I mean nobody, had ever heard from a Roman cross. If you're following along, look at what Jesus says next in verse 34. Jesus said, Father. Now before I go any further, understand this. When men are dying, they call for their mothers, not their fathers. But Jesus calls out to his Father, and he says this. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. At this point, I imagine that the crowd, they got extremely quiet. The criminals stopped yelling profanities and cursing. They had to be thinking, did we just hear this guy right? Because Jesus was saying the unthinkable. Actually, you know what Jesus was doing in this moment? He was praying for those who had crucified him. He was also praying for the guys to his right and his left. And let's be honest, if we're the two guys who are hanging beside Jesus, we probably thought the same thing that they did. Like, forgive them? Are you kidding me, Jesus? And they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, right, they know what they're doing. They know why we're hanging here. You know, if you've ever been wronged by someone or maybe hurt by their actions, it's not easy to forgive them, is it? I mean, even if you can forgive them, that is never going to happen right in the midst of what you're going through, is it? But this is exactly what we see Jesus do. And then catch what Luke writes next in verse 35. It says this. The crowds watched, the leaders spoke. He saved others, they said, let him save himself if he is really God's Messiah, the chosen one. Now understand, there's a huge crowd there on that day. And this wasn't uncommon when there was a crucifixion. I mean, everyone was coming out for a spectacle like this. In the crowd on that day are people who would probably listen to Jesus. There are those who had 5 days before probably been shouting these words, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In the crowd that day are the religious leaders, and they're watching this spectacle as well. And they're thinking to themselves, if he really is who he says he is, then he'll save himself. Some in the crowd that day hoped and believed that Jesus was who he said he was, and he hoped that he still was that person, but their hopes seemed dashed on this day. For others, this was just an imposter and a wannabe, a promise-breaking, kingdom-proclaiming Messiah who wasn't able to live up to his claims. Luke continues by saying this in verses 36 to 38. It says, the soldiers mocked him, too, by offering him a drink of sour wine. They called out to him, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. A sign fastened above his head with these words said this is the king of the Jews. You see, as Jesus hung on the cross, they were yelling, and that yelling, I imagine it only intensified. The soldiers mocked him. The crowd called out to him, you're supposed to be the king of the Jews, save yourself. Yet what we see about Jesus is that Jesus, in this moment, he did nothing. And then look at what Luke writes next in verse 39. It says, one of the criminals beside him scoffed. So you're the Messiah, or you prove it by saving yourself, and us too while you're at it. This is where our John Doe chimes in and he says, aren't you supposed to be able to do something about this? If you're really who you say that you are, then Jesus, like this would be happening to you. And then he says what maybe you've thought about God as you've gone through your own struggle. I mean, if there is a God, this wouldn't be happening to me. And really, what this guy was saying was, you aren't the Christ. Like you and your God, they're never going to save us. And for this guy, he thought, as life went, so God must go. That's why he said, you're nothing. You're not even what others suppose you to be. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever had one of those moments where you lost all fear of God? Because that's where this guy's at. He had literally lost all of fear of God. He didn't revere God as almighty and holy, and you know why? Because in his mind, God hadn't done anything for him. But you know what's interesting to me? You want to know the twist in this story. What this guy was thinking is, where is God at in all this? And you know where he was? 12 feet to his left. But I'll tell you, it wasn't because of social distancing. God was 12 feet away, but this guy, he didn't know it. And just like this guy, I think that sometimes what happens is we feel like God isn't near when the reality is God is always closer than we think. God is often in the places where we think to look for him the least, like on the cross next to some criminals. You know, when life is difficult or things get tough, it's easy to really want to point the finger at God and blame him for everything that's happening. But I want you to hear this today. The things that are happening in your life right now, the things that you're in the middle of, they're not God, but God is always right in the middle of those things. I believe that some of you need to hear that today. I want you to know that God is always in the middle of whatever it is that you're facing. Even this COVID-19 outbreak, God is in the middle of it, even when we can't see him or we aren't sure if he's there. You know, the famous artist Michelangelo, he painted a picture on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that's a famous piece of artwork, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's called The Creation of Adam. As you look at this picture, you can see the hand of God extending toward the hand of Adam. Now, what you find as you zoom in even more is the gap between the finger of God and Adam is ever so slightly separated. God's arm is extended, the muscles are flexed, and he's reaching toward Adam, yet giving Adam space. And as you look at this picture, what you see is Adam, his arm is halfway extended, but he's reclining. And it's almost like he's maybe not sure if he's ready to reach out to God. And what many believe Michelangelo was trying to portray and depict in this picture is the fact that God is always closer than we think. In fact, God is always near, but he gives us the choice to decide whether we will reach out or we'll pull back. For our John Doe, he didn't get this. But hanging on the other side of Jesus, this second criminal, he saw things for how they really were. But what we find out about this guy is it didn't start out that way. In fact, if you look at the gospel account that Matthew writes of Jesus' life, Matthew tells us that both criminals in this moment as they're hanging on the cross are yelling at Jesus. And if you compare these two guys, honestly, they had most things in common. The difference wasn't in how life had treated them or even how things had turned out. You look at their lives, you even look at their rap sheets, and the differences were probably minimal. But something happens for this other guy. Like all of a sudden, as he's hanging there on the cross, he stops. He doesn't say anything else. These words that Jesus says, Father, forgive them. They must have begun to sink in. In his mind, maybe he was like, there's something different about this Jesus guy. Like why is he asking for forgiveness for others? And then notice what Luke writes next in verses 40 and 41. It says, but the other criminal protested. Now, other translations, they use the word rebuked. And what Luke is saying here is this one criminal is saying, stop dissing Jesus. Like he's realizing we've got it wrong, because notice what he says next. He says, don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes. But this man hasn't done anything wrong. And then he said to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Notice, at first, it's almost as though he draws conclusions that are only about himself and the criminal who's hanging on the other side of Jesus, this guy who's mocking Jesus. And then my guess is that maybe he paused and he said, if an innocent man who suffers like a guilty man can maintain his faith in God, how much more should the two of us who are guilty believe in God and understand that we deserve this suffering? Like, he was realizing that God's not to blame for our current situation, we are. It had clicked for this guy. And as he read the sign that is above the head of Jesus that Pilate had ordered to be there, he realized this guy, Jesus, truly is the King of the Jews. And then this guy turns his attention to Jesus. He looks at Jesus and he says, Jesus, remember me after you die. He says, not because of what I've done, but in spite of what I've done. And then Luke goes on to say this in verse 43. This is what Jesus' reply is. He says, I assure you today that you will be with me in paradise. Understand what Jesus is saying to this guy. He's saying, what has happened to you is not because I don't love you or any thoughts that I've had about you. What you need to know is that I love you dearly and I am not about what you have experienced. Now, Luke closes the account with these words in verses 44 to 46. It says this, by this time it was about noon. Darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. The light from the sun had gone, and suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple had been torn down the middle. And Jesus shouted, Father, I entrust my spirit in your hands. And with those words, he breathed his last breath. Now let me ask you this today as we close. Have you ever confused life with God? Have you drawn your own conclusions about God based maybe on your own experiences? Maybe it was on a prayer that wasn't answered, a loved one that wasn't healed. Maybe it was on a job offer that wasn't received. Or maybe it's, for some of you as parents, it's a prodigal who hasn't yet returned home. Please hear this today. If this is how you have viewed God, maybe you've been led to understand God this way. Know this, that God is not what you have experienced. That God can be trusted in spite of what you experience. And here's why I say that. And you've got to listen to this, all right? I want you to lean in here for a minute. If you've tuned out, like don't miss this. God is not your life. God sent Jesus to bring you life. Maybe the reason you've tuned in today is these last few weeks is really been difficult for you. Like you've been searching for answers. And fears and uncertainty and doubts have been swirling. And right now life is just really confusing. What I hope that you find is what the second criminal on the cross found. That it's this, that in Jesus, you will find what you cannot find in this life. In Jesus, there is grace and there is mercy and there is forgiveness. You know, if you take the time to read the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, what you find is that he experienced the very same things that we do. Betrayal, temptation, grief, suffering, I mean, you name it. He knows what that's like. And the thing is, when Jesus came to this earth, he was fully man while at the same time fully God, but he never pulled the God card. Like he didn't decide to take a shortcut or cheat in spite of the hands that he got dealt. And you know, even though all of this life cost him, Jesus just continued to have confidence in God. So I want to challenge you, in spite of what hands you've been dealt in this life, like Jesus, I would encourage you to have the same confidence in God that Jesus did. Whatever you're facing right now, know that God can be trusted to redeem your experience. That God used Jesus' experience to redeem mankind. And if you choose to trust God, God can bring good from what life has thrown at you. That I believe that God can bring purpose to what life has brought your way. That your story can be used to tell an even greater story. So let me challenge you with this today. Respond as if there is a God who loves you rather than simply allowing life to happen to you. I want to tell you a story as we end today. Several years ago, there was a girl named Jessica who was a part of the children's ministry that my wife Amanda led in Cincinnati. And Jessica was diagnosed with cancer at an early age. She lived with this terrible disease for years. She had streaks of good days followed by months in the hospital, hooked up to machines, trying to give her body a fighting chance. But every time the cancer came back and the chemo wrecked her immune system, her body got weaker and weaker. And after years of fighting cancer finally got the best of Jessica's body, but not Jessica. You see, as Jessica knew her time was ending, she didn't look at life and her life and blame God. Instead, she chose to live an in spite of life kind of faith. As her time here on this earth neared the end, Jessica and her family, they chose not to plan a funeral, but instead they planned a wedding. And Jessica wanted her life to be marked by one of faith, so rather than being a funeral for Jessica asked her parents to have a wedding after she passed away, and she asked them to give her away to God. And let me tell you, as I watched that service, it was powerful. What Jessica and I believe her family showed those in attendance that day was what this in spite of life faith looked like. So can I challenge you today? Can I challenge you to be like Jessica? To be like the second guy on the cross who trusted Jesus? To have an in spite of life faith? Because what I've learned in my own faith journey is that life happens, but God can be trusted. Now my prayer for you is that you too would understand that. My prayer is that some of you in the midst of whatever is going on in your life right now would maybe put your trust in God for the first time. That maybe you put your trust in God all the time, that you wouldn't allow the news or social media to control your thoughts, but that you trust in the promises that God makes. For others of you today, maybe you've been on the run from God. And you've been doubting if he can be trusted. But today, because of this story, maybe you realize that you need to return to him. I'm praying that some of you would do that today. And then I think there are some of you who are probably joining in with us today, and I'm glad that you are. I'm glad you're watching. For some of you, you need to come to him for the first time, and if that's you, we want to talk to you about what that looks like. What are those next steps like for following Jesus in your life? In fact, we'd love for you to let us know that in the comment section. And someone from our team this week will reach out to you. In fact, we'll reach out to you today. Compass North Fort Worth, and those of you who are joining in, let me just say this. What we have to understand is that life is going to happen, but God can be trusted. No matter what life has delivered or what cards you've been dealt, know that God can be trusted. As we close out this series today, maybe there's something that you need to give over to God. Maybe for some of you, you've not surrendered to him, and so we want to give you a few moments today to do that. And so while we take communion today, we want you to spend some time letting go of those things that you have not surrendered to God. Each week here at Compass, we take this meal together as a reminder of all that God did for us. That he sent his son to die on the cross for our sins, that he gave up so much because of his love for you and for me. And so today, as you eat the bread and you drink the juice or whatever it is that you have in your home, take this time to remind yourself that life is going to happen, but God can be trusted. And he showed us that when he sent Jesus to this earth for you and for me. So let's celebrate that today. Would you pray with me? God, today we come to you. And we thank you that you can be trusted. We thank you that through Jesus, you remind us that you gave us your son so that we could have life. God, today I pray for those who maybe are struggling, who are going through a difficult time in their life. They're going through a difficult season, and they've been wrestling with, why is this happening? God, I pray that today they would surrender those things to you. and that you would fill them with hope, and that you would fill them with all that they need in the midst of all that they're going through. God, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for your love for us. We thank you for all that you've done. We pray this in your name.